Welcome to Inkblots, the podcast of International Society of Rorschach. Today we have the pleasure and the honor to have with us Dr. Odile Husain, who has studied in Switzerland and is one of the most important personalities in the called School of Lausanne. Odile Husain has been twice vice president of the International Society of Rorschach. She has been twice general secretary, twice member at large, and very well remembered in charge of organizing the summer seminars. In the last summer seminar in Italy, in Genoa, she was also the coordinator of our work in which we talked about psychosis. Odile Husain has written several articles and papers, regularly published in French in journals worldwide, and also she has written 3 books in French. The first one was Psychopathologie et polysémie, études différentielles à travers le Rorschach et le TAT. A second one published in 2005, Les phénomènes particuliers au Rorschach, une relecture pointilliste, volume 1. Third one called Les phénomènes particuliers au Rorschach, une relecture pointilliste, volume 2. Works regularly in supervision, in public supervisions, and also she has taught at the university with Mariette Lepage about violence and psychosis. Well, thank you for giving us this time, Odile, and happy to have the opportunity to talk with you for doing this podcast. Let's start for your studies. Well, tell us about your studies in Geneva, in the University of Geneva first, and the way you get acquainted to Rorschach.
I chose my profession when I was 15 years old. I decided to become a psychologist. And I used to go to Switzerland to a resort since I was very small, where there were lots of people who used to come every year, every summer. And I met there a psychoanalyst. She was a customer at the hotel. And since I chose to become a psychologist, I decided to talk to her about the profession. And she is the one who told me about the university in Geneva. And so, since Switzerland was a country that was familiar to me, I started inquiring about the programs in Geneva. At the time, I was living in England, in London, and I first applied to universities in England, and then I also applied to Geneva University. And there was a major difference because in England, all the programs were basically a maximum of 6 to 8 hours of teaching, and the rest you would work on a project, more or less full time. And I knew I didn't want that. And in Geneva, you went to the university Monday to Friday, 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And you had many courses on many topics. So that was my first choice because I wanted to be exposed to many different topics. At the time, I wanted to be a child psychotherapist. That was my idea. So I took off for Geneva. I was 17 years old. And I went to the university, and those were very rich, stimulating years. So there was the program at the time, I'm sure it's changed since then. There were 2 years that were common for everybody. And then after 2 years, you had to choose a specialization. Clinical psychology was, of course, the most popular, I would say. Most people went into clinical. And so that was my first choice. And there was also something called Psychologie génétique et expérimentale, which was entirely dedicated to Piaget's work. Piaget was no longer teaching at the university, but we used to see him every Monday. He used to be there, and we'd see him with his briefcase and his beret and his pipe. And he had trained a lot of people. All his research assistants had become teachers. And so I decided to also do the specialization in Psychologie génétique expérimentale. So it was a 4-year program. So it was a bit like having kind of two masters in a way. It was the licence, but then you kind of specialized. And so I did these two, which meant a lot of work. I also did just about every course that was optional, because I found out that the teachers who gave the courses that were optional were all clinicians, whereas the teachers who gave the other obligatory courses were not necessarily clinicians, they were researchers. So I went to all the courses given by clinicians. And that is actually how I met Frida Rossell. So we had 2 years of teaching of the Rorschach, of projectives, in year 3 and year 4 of the university. The first year I had a teacher who was retiring. It was her last year. And I have absolutely no recollection of anything that she said. Nothing. And then came Frida Rossell, who was a very special kind of individual. And she came, and the very first class, she came and showed us a video of a patient that she had tested. And I still remember that moment. And it was just fascinating. And so I went to these Rorschach classes. She taught us how to score using the French system. And I was terrorized because the scoring business was something very complicated. I still remember one of the exam questions. There was a word there that I couldn't understand, which actually referred to color. And so I didn't score it properly because I didn't know the word. But anyhow, beyond the scoring, I could already kind of sense that there was something really interesting over there. So that's actually how I met her. And I got interested, but I still had the idea of being a child psychotherapist.
And then what happens?
So then what happens is Frida works in the city of Lausanne, which is 60 kilometers away from Geneva, where I live. And I do my 5th year, which is a year of training. It's a practicum, it's like an internship. And around that time, Frida is looking for a psychologist to fill in a job, an opening at the Clinic of External Psychiatry in Lausanne, which is called la Polyclinique Psychiatrique Universitaire. And in our group, she selects somebody, a classmate who was with me, and that person takes the job. And like for every job, there's a 3-month trial period. And after 2 months, that person decides to give up. And she doesn't like the environment, the population, the kind of work. And during that year, I had been sending CVs. In those days, you wrote your CVs, you typed, there was no computer. And so I had 35 CVs, job applications. And in Switzerland, I was a foreigner, a foreign national. And Switzerland was very difficult to find a job when you were a foreign national. And I had come up with nothing. And then suddenly one day she comes up to me and she asks me if I'm interested in the job. And I'm kind of wondering how come, because the position has just been filled. And she tells me, no, that person has left. Would you like to apply? And I said, yeah, but I'm a foreign national. She said, don't worry. And I don't know what she did, but she did something to pretended that I could do something that nobody else could do, which was completely absurd because I had just come out of university. But the one thing that she used was the fact that I had this Piagetian knowledge. Because it is true that people did not have both. I had both the titles. So that actually was very useful because most people were clinical psychologists, had done just one title and I had both. So she
Yes.
used that and she got me a work permit. She got me the
Oh,
position, she got me the work permit, and I started. And this was like a factory because we did testing. So I had a part-time job, 60%, 3 days a week. But you have to remember that in the canton de Vaud, at that time, and I believe it's still fairly close to that, a full time was 43 hours and 20 minutes, not 35 hours. So I would get up very early in the morning, take the train, walk to work, come back in the evening. And the other 2 days I worked at the university. So I had 110% work. And I would do over my 3 days, I had 3 testings. So every week, 3 testings for about 5 years. And I saw just about everything because this was general psychiatry, consultation cases, and forensic cases, all kinds. So criminal cases, insurance cases, military cases, all kinds. And then consultation cases, people who had decompensated, been hospitalized, people who applied for psychotherapy, etc. So, I mean, this was like an incredible learning experience. And there were several of us who started at the same time. So we were a team of juniors and there was a team of seniors. There were 3 seniors, there were 3 juniors. We each had our supervisor. So Frida was my supervisor and my mentor. And the other juniors were paired with another supervisor. And because it was a teaching hospital, there was space for seminars, for working together, for thinking together. And it was allowed and it was promoted, which was great. And so very quickly, she invited me to join the group of seniors who were working with Leslie Pons on his thesis on exhibitionism. And that is how I started working on perversion.
yeah.
He had 22 cases, and we basically started, deciphering them and analyzing them. And I discovered that there was this author called Bergeret and this model that Frida and Colette Merceron were using and referring to. And she always said that when she read Bergeret in the 70s, it was like a revelation in the sense that it kind of fitted with the data. And the model, the structural model he had, made a lot of sense for them. And Frida was very good with scoring and mastering the French system. It was the beginning of the Exner system at the time. And I had to score. I had these columns on my papers and I had to score. And very quickly, she picked up that I wasn't very good at scoring. I wasn't very interested, but I was interested in something else. And as I mentioned in the conference, the opening conference that was given at the Congress in Paris, I thanked her for allowing me to be delinquent because very quickly she allowed me not to score and to do something else. And so I was regularly part of this group on perversion, which finally led to Leslie finishing his thesis, but also for us, we wrote our first paper on perversion, which we
I remember.
presented.
Yes, I remember one about taking Luce Irigaray as an author for the Analyse du discours,
Yes,
discourse analysis, isn't it?
yes, yes, correct. And we presented this in Barcelona.
Oh, yeah.
And this is 1984.
Yes, I
And
remember.
Paul Lerner was in the audience. And Paul Lerner basically came up to us and said, "We'd like to publish this in our next book." So that's how our contact with the Americans started. And so we became friends with Paul for many years. And so that was one group. And then we were 3 juniors, and my friends Ingrid Roussel and Ariane Dreyfus, we got together on a weekly basis and we started on psychosis. We were interested in kind of going through the structures of personality and starting at the bottom and going up, like looking at psychosis. And that's how we started working. So first we worked on schizophrenia, comparing paranoid schizophrenia and simple schizophrenia. Then we moved on to paranoia, and we had many cases of different forms of paranoia, and we wrote a lot on paranoia.
I would like to ask you, what's about the Lausanne School? What can you tell us about that?
Mm.
Now you know that you take Bergeret as a psychopathological frame, and you are no longer coding. Let me say that the French school system comes from loosely Austria, so it comes from Switzerland in the first step. So you were coded in that French loosely Austrian system. You decided not to code anymore, and what was your work with the protocols? In which way you can tell us the characteristic, the different, the way you were analyzing the protocols?
Yeah. So I think the work that I did initially, I think there were two phases. The first part was getting familiar with how Frida and Colette were kind of transferring the ideas of structure of personality and character and the different concepts of Bergeret, who basically kind of defines every structure in terms of things. Well, every structure has got a kind of specific object relation. Every structure has got a specific type of anxiety, and so on. And
Yeah.
so the first years, I worked in Switzerland, and then after I went to Pakistan for a few years where I was very much on my own. And I worked the way I had done at the clinic. The change happened when I came to Canada. Because when I came to Canada, I discovered that here in Canada, psychologists were very autonomous in terms of their work. And it was impossible to have a practice where you only did assessment, because when I came here, the only thing I knew was assessment. And in Pakistan, I did a lot of assessment as well. I never had touched psychotherapy. So I wasn't working with children and I wasn't working in psychotherapy. So it's very, very far from my initial idea. But when I came to Canada, where everybody kind of opens a private practice, because once you have your title, you are entitled to open a private practice. You can't survive just doing assessment. And so I said, oh my God, I have no training in psychotherapy. So the first thing I did was to sign up for a 3-year program in psychodynamic psychotherapy, which I really enjoyed. And then came the idea that, well, I have now learned something about psychotherapy, but I'm a very good assessor. So, how do I kind of get this assessment to be meaningful for psychotherapy? Which is something, of course, I had never learned. Frida was never interested in psychotherapy, that was not her thing. And so I thought, what a shame if I can't use it. And I started thinking about how can I use this to benefit the psychotherapy. And so I kind of muddled along for a while until progressively, and this is years and years of experimenting and practice, until I developed a model of how I could use my assessment skills in psychotherapy. And that has taken me, whatever, 25 years or whatever. But I think now we have a fairly good working model. And I don't know, 12 years ago or 15 years ago, I met Stephen Finn, and I had never known of him. And we had a meal together in the US, and I told him what I was doing. And he said, oh, he said, well, in a way differently, but we're doing something similar. And I realized that it was very much the in thing, this thing called therapeutic assessment that I had been doing in my little corner, um, with a slightly different way of doing things, but the idea was somewhat the same. And so that was one aspect that changed. And the other that changed is I started teaching. And for teaching, I had to find a way of presenting the data in a way that was not just scribbling stuff on my protocol. And that's when I came up with the grid. which is the grid that now a lot of people who work with me know, which is just a grid with 6 columns, and it's got object relations, boundaries, self and identity, anxiety, defense mechanism, and thought processes, and the rapport with reality. So it's fairly straightforward. But I think one of the main differences is that the system is the same for the Rorschach and the TET. And I think that's quite unique in the Lausanne School, because until now, students were always taught you have a system, whichever system, but you have a system for the Rorschach, you have a system for the TET. And what I found looking at reports that people write, they don't know how to put it together. So they've used Exner for the Rorschach, they've used Shentu for the TET, and now they say on the Rorschach there's this, on the TET there's that, and then they don't know how to put it together, how to synthesize it. So one of the things I looked at is how can we keep the same reference? Yes, the two tests are different. They bring out different things, but at the same time, you find many things that converge and that are constant, not always, but a fair amount of things you will find on both tests. And that is something that I'm interested in the convergence between the tests with the clinical data, with eventually other tests and so on. And that's something that I'm interested in. So with time, and basically the Lausanne School looks at these topics, which come mostly from Bergeret, but some of it comes more from Piaget. So we've integrated the two. But it's very much looking at content and formulation. Americans often say that we do content analysis. I think that is not entirely true. I think we do content analysis, but we also look at language, how it is said, which is something that Schaefer talked about.
Yeah.
The formulation, the specific verbalization. So it comes up in the American system with things like deviant verbalization and so on, or illogical reasoning and so on. The Americans are very strong on thought processes. But we look at something, for example, that is not scored anywhere, is the relationship with the examiner. And that is something there is no scoring for in no system. And it's something I had talked to with Exner in Boston. And he said, yes, it's very important. We tried to formalize it, but we were never very successful. So he was a great clinician and he actually talked about these things, but he didn't, it's not in his books, right? And so it's a bit like if it's not in the book, then nobody really pays attention. So when I do the international seminar with James Kleiger, which is a seminar we run now, we're in our 4th year, we complement each other because he does the RPAS, he has a psychoanalytic thinking as well, I do my grid, and we kind of come together, and it's really interesting because people really see the richness of using, complementary kind of approaches. And we look at, Lévy used to say, l'analyse du discours est illimitée. Analyzing speech is illimited, it's limitless,
Yeah.
The limitations are us, not the discourse. And you look at protocols, and sometimes 20 years later, you look at the same protocol, and I have a student who say, oh, but there's this, and you say, yes, I've never thought about this. And so it's limitless, you can, it's endless, you can keep on finding stuff. It is very much a microscopic kind of way of looking at things. And then afterwards, you have to zoom out and you have to try and get a big picture.
Passionate clinicians.
Yes. And the big picture comes in the summarization. I do always a drawing of, it's a triangle upside down. I call it an inverted pyramid. The idea of the iceberg, that the bigger part of the iceberg is underneath and you don't see it. And that's what Bergeret calls the structure. And so I fill in what kind of structure and then what kind of traits of personality do you see on top?
Yeah.
And then what symptoms do you see above that, the manifest?
Yeah.
And I summarize it. And then treatment plan.
Bergeret system, a frame in any case.
Yes.
And tell me, you did some research. You studied a lot about psychosis. I remember a very good paper written by you on psychosis, as well as Analyse du discours, other papers, and the way you analyze the special codings. And but among all those research and studies and get you have done, which one you can name now as one of that one that gives you more in a certain way you get more interest about and you'd like to talk us about it.
So I would say that the last research, we spent 10 years on manic depression. And I think um, the topics we had really gone into, perversion, paranoia, were topics that people didn't talk much about. But these are cases that mostly come through forensic work. Paranoiacs don't come and see a psychologist, they come and see the lawyer.
Yeah.
Okay? These are
Yeah.
not people who come in consultation.
Yeah.
So, manic depression, I think, has been a major, major contribution of the Lausanne School. And that's what people tell us. And it is a very usable uh, work because it improves the treatment of a lot of patients. So we were confronted with a lot of patients. We were all working in psychiatry, adult psychiatry, and we were confronted with patients who very often come with recurring depressions that somehow don't really get treated.
I see.
And they they take antidepressants, they are a bit better, they come back 3 years later, they come back 6 years later, or they have kind of borderline kind of behaviors where they are angry, they act out, and people don't like them because of their behavior, or they have a lot of anxiety. But these are all people who kind of don't get better really, in spite of being well looked after.
Yeah.
And there were about 4 or 5 of us, and we started thinking in terms of manic depression, also because we were still in this project of going through the different psychotic organizations. We had done schizophrenia, we had done paranoia, and then we were looking at the third classical entity. Yes, the DSM got rid of the word psychosis. It used to be psychose, maniaco-depressive, and that the psychosis went out. Maniaco-depressive went out and became bipolarity. But we were interested in this third form. And we started looking at these protocols in a qualitative way, and we said, it's strange. They seem to have something in common. So we went through 2 steps. We did first a kind of research where we started off with the diagnosis of psychiatrists who had diagnosed bipolarity. These are very small research. It's 8 patients every time because it's qualitative and you're looking at every detail. And, we're clinicians working full time. We don't have that much time. We meet once a week. So it's very limited what we can do. We started with that. We had a first idea, wasn't entirely satisfying, but the diagnosis was based on the diagnostic impression of the psychiatrist. And then we said, okay, now we do a second research, and now we're going to choose the cases based on our impression, based on the tests only, not on the clinical data, not on the symptoms. And we chose 8 patients with different presentations, but we felt they had something in common in terms of affect. They had some kind of intensity. And we took those and we analyzed them, and it gave us, and we did the TAT. Actually, it was a choice. We took only the TAT because we felt that affect would probably be easier to identify on the TAT than on the Rorschach. So we chose the TAT. And so we went through all their formulations and we kind of analyzed them, we categorized them, and they were quite homogeneous as a group. And we discovered that there were a certain number of things that kind of were specific to this little population of 8 people. For example, they had a way of expressing affect with a lot of intensity. Like they would say, she is very despaired. She will never forget. A lot of adverbs that introduce intensity and various other things, and what we called affective symbiosis and different things. So we kind of came up with these themes and what was dominant, and we described it. And this work actually I presented in the summer seminar, which was on Zoom in 2020, because in the pandemic everything got cancelled. And I
Yeah.
was organizing the summer seminars. We were supposed to be in Prague, it got cancelled. And I decided to keep the idea of the summer seminar, but to do it on Zoom. I had just learned Zoom a few months ago, and I thought, I think we can do this. And not many people thought this would happen, but it did happen. So in September, we did that, and I presented this. And it was, people were interested. Then I presented it at SPA. And then after that, Irving Vine,
Yes.
can you hear me? After that, Irving Weiner and Jim Kleiger invited me to participate in this book, which is called Psychological
Oh,
Assessment of Bipolar Spectrum Disorders. And
blue
I have
cover.
and I have
Yeah.
published a chapter in this book. And this book, actually, by Irv and Jim, has been very successful. It
Yeah.
was chosen by Choice as the 600 most important academic titles of
Oh,
last year. And
wonderful.
so it's a very different approach to what is in the book, because it's very qualitative and it's very different. But I think it has helped a lot of people identify these patients who are on a continuum of the bipolar spectrum, and they don't fit the DSM definitions. They fit the idea of this bipolarity spectrum, or soft polarity by Akiskal. And what is amazing is that when one understands that and one treats them adequately with mood stabilizer, they actually improve, really. So that, I
Yeah.
think, has determining work for.
And tell me, Odile, after all your experience, in which way you can tell us now what's so fascinating of the Rorschach for you?
I think it's so fascinating in the sense that it shows so much the representation that people have of themselves and of the world.
Mm.
It is such a powerful tool. I
Yeah.
think, I mean, when I say Rorschach, I always say Rorschach and TAT, because for me, it always goes together. I think these are such powerful tools. And I honestly believe it is a window into how people represent themselves things. I mean, you can make so many inferences. For example, lately I've had in supervision several cases of manic depression, I mean personalities. And it is fascinating to see. I saw a 26-year-old and a 23-year-old in supervision. And it is fascinating to see how both these people, they cannot actually accomplish the task, in the sense that the material always means something to them. They bring it back into their life. They are not able to just treat it as, here is a task. What does this look like? There is a task which is out there. And with them, the boundaries is always too close. So it comes back to them. It's them on the card. It's them everywhere. And I tell myself, well, if everything concerns you, how do you approach the real world? How can you
Mm.
see it as neutral if it always concerns you? And so it impairs their functioning. And you understand why,
Yeah.
because they can't actually do this task. Sometimes, yes, but much too often it comes back to them, and it's an impairment. And
Yeah.
if they're only 23, 26, if they carry on like that in 10 years, what happens?
Yeah.
So I think these are very
Very
powerful tools.
Yeah. And tell me, what do you think may be the future of the Rorschach? If we can do such kind of a scene, such kind of a imagination about the future, what do you think are the lines that may become the main lines or the main interests of the future of the Rorschach? Can you imagine that now?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time, I think, when we were all very, very worried about the future, about, I think many of us, about these tools kind of dying. And I think there is still a possibility because, on the one hand, universities, and I don't know how it is, for example, in Argentina, but for example, here in Quebec, there is only one university left that really teaches projectives. And what they've done, which they did in Switzerland also, is that the day people retire, those who teach, they just don't renew the course. And that's what they
Yeah,
did in Geneva when Frida retired. They didn't renew the course. Here in Quebec, they did exactly the same thing. Every time a teacher retired, they just got rid of the course on testing. They will talk about the Rorschach, the TAT, in 45 hours, where you go through all the tests, the Wechsler, the MMPI, the Rorschach, the TAT, and that's it,
yes,
so you will get 3 hours or
impossible.
whatever, something like that. So on the university side, they have done away mostly with these tests. And of course, the usual story, not scientific, outdated, whatever. But on the other hand, on the private side, on the training side, and that is one of the immense satisfactions I have, because I'm teaching now. This year is my 30th year of teaching privately. My institute was created in 2011. So now it's very formalized. It's a 5-year
Yeah,
program and so on. And every year here, it's word of mouth. We do one ad in the Journal of the Order of Psychologists just for the visibility, but I never get anybody through the ad. It's just word of mouth. And I have 24 seats every year. It's partly on Zoom and partly in presence. We've been on Zoom for the last 3 years because of the pandemic, but now we're returning to one class a year in presence. And when the registration opens at the end of August, last year in 4 hours, everything was taken.
incredible, wonderful.
So
I know.
I tell myself that's the data.
Yes,
And
that's the
I
data. I
that's the
agree.
data. And I look at the kids, they're young. Most of them they've just finished their PhD, or they have between 1 and 5 years of experience. I don't have that many seasoned psychologists. I've gone through those people a long time ago. But they're all good. They're all motivated. They're all really interested. They ask interesting questions. They really want to learn. Not
Yeah,
everybody carries on through the 5 years, but I still have about, I would say, 70% of people do the whole program, and then the postgraduate programs. And so I think these people, they go in private practice, they often go in the public system, they often have both, and it mushrooms because we're already at the second generation, because many of them have supervisors who've done the training with me. So over here, I look at this and the expansion is just incredible. I don't know how it is elsewhere, but I honestly think that, and that would be my recommendation to the ISR, I don't think we can count on the universities. I think in all the countries, if the universities don't teach, then there has to be private programs where we can attract psychologists who are in practice or PhD students who are finishing and actually teach the Rorschach. And I think it will be successful because the
yeah,
moment you show them how it's applied to treatment, how it improves the chances, how it improves the prognosis. And I build this progressively. And they go, wow. And then they come in supervision and they apply it. And then they see the impact of adequate testing. And they go, wow.
Yes, in many countries, it's more or less the same, like in what you are talking about in Canada. In many universities, courses around assessment, personality assessment, are closing.
Yeah.
But this, those psychologists started outside or postgraduate programs to study and to learn, and many of them remain in their field. So your experience is repeated in other countries also
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for this time, Odile. It was a wonderful conversation, and let's celebrate the good health of Rorschach and personality assessment.
Absolutely. I thank you, Fernando. Thank you so much.